Welcome to Quilters Cupboard's First Tip Tuesday. I decided that I was going to do a video on blocking a quilt for our first video. For those of you who don't know what blocking a quilt is, maybe you've seen your pretty wall hanging kind of all wonky and wavy on the wall, and you didn't know how to fix it. Blocking your quilt is the answer. If you have quilted it unevenly in density across the surface of the quilt, sometimes that can cause the waviness. Sometimes the difference in the direction of the grain of fabric when you're piecing your quilt can cause it. There's lots of different causes, but one solution is blocking it. It doesn't have to be hard. I choose to do it in my home office where I have some clear space if I move some things out of the way, and I can shut the door. Nobody's going to be in here for a day, and it can go on the floor undisturbed, and I have the carpet to pin it to. You can, if you don't have carpet in your entire home, you can get some of the styrofoam SM boards that they use for insulation. It's a high density styrofoam, and you can lay those out on your floor. If you need more than one because your quilt is a little bigger, you can tape them together so that they don't try and split apart. Or you can, I've even been told about people doing it outside and then kind of, bringing it in and standing it up against the wall in the garage once everything is secure and pinned. Either way, I do it on my carpet. The supplies you'll need, I'm going very basic. You can get into high-tech toys like, right angle laser finders and all that kind of stuff. But I'm just using a tape measure, a lung ruler. This one's 24 by 6, square ruler for squaring up your corners, and lots of pins. I prefer to use the stronger T-pins, but I couldn't find any last night, and I really wanted to get this done today. So we're using what we got, and these are just those, little plastic ball head pins. I don't know if you can see those. Just the typical sewing pins you would use for sewing. So those will do the job. I prefer stronger ones, as I said, but this will work. So we're going to start out with, I like to always put a sheet over the carpet just to prevent any sort of dyes or stains from coming up from the carpet fibers. This is a pretty light carpet, so it's probably not an issue, but you never know. Better safe than sorry. Then we're going to get our quilt, and I usually do the first blocking with it unbound. So, so that when you put your binding on, you know that your quilt is nice and square and straight. So if you've already bound it, you can certainly still block it, but it is nicer to start with a quilt that doesn't have any binding on it. I trim it down to about 1.5 inches or 2 inches past the edge of the quilt top, and just throw it in the washing machine. Cold water, rinse and spin. You don't need to do a whole wash cycle, and then pull it out, and what you're going to do is you're going to lay it out nice and flat. I measured the quilt before we started, and I did use a flannel backing, so I'm assuming there's going to be some shrinkage here. What you want to try and do is get it out close to what it was before. Sometimes that's not possible, but that's sort of what you're aiming for. So we started out with a quilt that was 41 by 41, and right now, without stretching it out, we're at 39.5 by 39 3/4. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take one side, I'm going to put a pin right in the corner, and you want to angle these out so that if the quilt is pulling like this, it's not going to pull the pin out as if you were doing it like that. So angle them out and make sure that they get right through the carpet into the carpet pad. Then I'm going to measure from that pin down here and just gently tug this out till it gets to, well, we can get it to about 40 and a half here. And I'll be happy with that for now. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my square ruler right on the corner. And I'm going to take some pins and I'm going to gently tug this out so that the edge of the quilt goes along the edge of the ruler as I'm pinning. And you want a pin in the edge of that quilt about every inch or so. The more pins, the better, because in some cases there's going to be a lot of tension on this quilt as you're pulling it back into shape. Just a word about blocking. You might not want to do something like this for a king-size bed quilt, let's say. But certainly for a quilt that you know is going to hang on the wall, you want it to hang as straight and beautiful as possible. So blocking a quilt is really just part of the finishing process. And then once I get to the end of my square ruler, I'm going to line up my long ruler right along the edge so that I'm getting a longer straight line here. And I'm going to continue to pin that all the way along the edge. Hopefully you can see this on the camera, but you can see as I'm getting to this corner where we've measured our length close to where it was before we wet the quilt, it's not quite straight. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this pin out and not let it stretch back and just straighten it out a little bit so that we can continue to get a perfectly straight edge here. You've got your pins in the carpet so that everything is going to be, you can guide your ruler along the pins that are in the edge there and just put your square ruler down in the other corner so that you can get this corner square. So you'll want to line it up with the pins that you already have in place. And sometimes you need to readjust. And you'll want to get this corner of the ruler in line with your pin here. Finish pinning the side. And then you'll want to take your measuring tape and do the same thing that we did for the first side. And make sure that you're tugging this out as close as you can get to your original measurement. You can kind of eyeball this and try to make sure that it's straight across here. It's not going to be though until you go across with your ruler and tug it out. So now I can start working along the bottom and getting that edge straight. And we know that because we're using a square ruler, we've got this edge perfectly straight, and as we tug this one out, you're going to end up with a perfectly square corner. And just like we did previously, when you get to the end of your square ruler, you're going to take your long ruler and butt it up against the edge to give you that extra length, keeping it perfectly straight. And you basically work around the quilt in that manner for the rest of the quilt. Occasionally you run into something where you need to adjust. Like we did for the last two corners, we will take our measuring tape, and I'm going to just double check the measurement on this side, and we're at 40 and a half. So I want to make sure that this side is also at 40 and a half inches. Once we have that measured and it's all nice and the same length as the other side, we continue along the edge of the square ruler and put your pins in to straighten out the other side. Now that you've got three sides and all four corners down, you want to make sure that your bottom width is the same as your top width, or else you don't have a square quilt. And I'm at 40 and a half there. And 40 and a half there. Occasionally, if you get to the fourth side of your quilt and it isn't the same width at one end as it is at the other, you'll need to readjust the pins a little bit on either side to stretch it out a little bit more or bring it in a little bit to match the width at the bottom. It happens sometimes. Sometimes they're a real pain to stretch out, but they do have some give in them when they're wet, which is why we block them when they're wet. If they're the same width at the top and bottom, you can go ahead and keep pinning along your fourth side. And that's it. You're all done. I usually leave them to dry on the floor for about 12, 18 hours. You can leave them 24 if you really want to make sure that they're good and dry. In my experience, it really doesn't take them very long now, especially when it's warm in summer. Once it is completely dry, you come back in, you take all the pins out, trim the quilt down as you normally would, and then put your binding on. If you're binding, or if you're blocking a quilt that you have already bound. It's basically the same process, only you will go in and you'll put your pins right in the very ditch of the binding. Sometimes it's a little harder to get those perfectly square, depending on how bad they were when you put the binding on. Usually it's okay though. And then you can add your sleeve and hang it on the wall and it will look absolutely beautiful. I'll make sure to include some shots of that when it's done, and I hope this helps you in getting your wall hangings and wall quilts to hang perfectly straight so that they look beautiful.